Okay, this is lecture number 5. It's the last part of Guelzo's book on Reconstruction, chapter 6 and the epilogue. So let's start with the notes and work our way through. That's not my question. There it is. Okay. So as Guelzo says, this is Reconstruction is often discussed as a conflict between the executive branch and the legislative branch. And we have seen that certainly through the course of this, most notably in coming to a head in the 1866 election. So what Guelzo says is, yes, it is absolutely a dispute between a constitutional dispute over control of this effort as part of a legislative executive branch conflict. But he says, in focusing solely on legislative and executive branch conflicts, you overlook a crucial component, which is the third branch of the government, the judicial branch. And so this is not just between the two branches, legislative and executive. It's something that the legislative branch seeks to enlist the judicial branch in these efforts. And to some degree, they are thwarted in this effort by the decisions of the judicial branch. So what exactly are we talking about here? Well, first, the legislative, first, the Constitution is very clear about delineating powers in the legislative and executive branch, and the fact that sometimes those powers overlap. That is part of the design. And it sets up that third branch to be the co-equal branch, the judicial branch. But as far as the Constitution goes, it doesn't really spell out in great detail what the role of the judicial branch is. And so historically, the judicial branch has sort of, over time, fought to create a larger space for itself in this sort of dispersal of powers. And in this post-Civil War period, the legislative branch was seeking to enlist the judicial branch in this effort to further the protection of the freedmen population in the South. Part of the reason why they did so, there's multivariate reasons for why they did it, but a part of the reason is because the chief executive, Andrew Johnson, was opposed to what the legislative branch was trying to do. And so it was very difficult for the legislative branch. They had to continually override Andrew Johnson's vetoes. And the fact that Andrew Johnson was not particularly enthralled with what they were passing, as you know, Andrew Johnson is the chief executive of the executive branch. And so their job is to execute and to ensure laws are being properly followed. So if the executive branch is none too keen on promoting these laws, it makes it difficult for them to function in the way that the legislative branch hopes. So they seek to enlist the judicial branch, and the way they do so is twofold. One we've talked about in some measure of detail because we talked about the passage of constitutional amendments, and I'll refer back to that in a bit. The other thing they do is that they seek to pass laws that are federal laws that are going to bring protection of the freedmen population before federal courts and ultimately the Supreme Court. And so they're seeking an expansive effort to protect the freedmen, but they're thwarted in this effort by the actions of the Supreme Court. Because as Congress is passing laws designed to protect the freedmen more broadly, to protect their civil rights, to assert federal protection, as we discussed last lecture, talking about things like the anti-Klan laws, the Supreme Court actually favors a much more narrow interpretation of this. And so they seek to limit the impact of federal legislation. These seek to limit who these federal laws that are being passed by the Congress apply to. And in a couple of notable Supreme Court rulings, they really kind of trim the wings of this expansive federal effort. The Slaughterhouse and Cruikshank efforts, they're relatively complex Supreme Court rulings, but what I want us to take from it, what Guelzo takes from it in this particular context, is that what they do is instead of federalizing crimes, they serve to limit the application of these laws only when people are acting in official capacity. So if the sheriff is engaging in efforts that violate federal law, like the anti-Klan laws, as a sheriff, well, then that is something that those laws would apply to. However, if the sheriff is acting as an off-duty ruffian, it's not that he is immune from being prosecuted for breaking laws. It's that the Supreme Court asserts that these are the responsibility, the jurisdiction of state and local authorities, not federal authorities. So the practical intent of this is by limiting these laws, that it really limits the ability of the legislative branch to protect the freedmen during this and Republicans in this 1870s period. So Reconstruction is motoring along, as we have seen. There's a revolution in Southern society. The Republican Party is installing carpetbaggers, scalawags, and freedmen through the ballot box into positions of authority. And this is a Republican-led effort, not just at the regional level of the American South, but this is a national Republican government, and there is a problem. The Grant administration, although it should be noted not Grant himself, is remarkably corrupt, because a lot of American politics in the 19th century is remarkably corrupt. And so this corruption at the top level in Grant's cabinet, in some spectacularly dramatic corruption events, this undermines the authority of the Republican Party. The local and state governments in the American South under Reconstruction are also marred by corruption. It's the way that politics works. But there's a problem for Reconstruction's corruption that's different than any other type of Reconstruction or any other type of corruption. Corruption's always bad, but it's doubly bad in the American South because it undermines the worthiness of this Reconstruction effort in the eyes of its supporters in the North and the West, because Reconstruction is only continuing because of the support of Northerners and Westerners, right? So we see from the very beginning, the white Southern population is resistant to Reconstruction. It's being forced upon them by the North and the West, and every story or every example of corruption undermines whether or not it's worth it in the eyes of its supporters in the North and West. And so, unsurprisingly, Southern Democrats go to great lengths to emphasize and make abundantly clear how corrupt government is in the American South. It's no different than government anywhere else in the nation. It just carries with it more implications because only the federal government and supporters from outside the region, by and large, are supporting Reconstruction in the South. Ladled on top of this problem is the economic panic of 1873. In 1873, the railroad bond market, which was a bubble economy, was superheated and overinflated. The returns on bonds were speculative. They were continuing to increase. And so the price that bonds were selling at was unsustainable, right? There would be no profit that would actually redeem the very high levels of return that bond offerings were promising. So for example, this is an economy where you have, it's a relatively cash poor and capital poor time in American history. There's not a lot of money to invest. And building railroads is what's known as a capital intensive business, meaning you need a lot of money. So if you have a relatively small pool of money for investment and a very large demand, that makes it difficult to attract that investment. So how does one attract investment? Well, you promise a higher rate of return. So it becomes a very speculative, competitive market for bond issuers to attract those funds that are absolutely necessary to build these very expensive operations such as railroad, right? So the promise is, you have to increase what you're going to return. So if one bond is offered at 10%, in order to attract money, the next bond offering has to offer 12. And if the 12% starts attracting money, then the bond offering at 10 ups their return to 15. As you can see, this begins to untether the bond value from what the actual value that can be returned, because the bond is going to have to be redeemed by the profits of the railroad company at some point. If they can't meet those bond obligations, well, then the people who purchase those bonds aren't going to get the return they were promised. And worst case, which had been happening, if the railroad company goes out of business, then those bonds are not worth anything, right? So this bond bubble economy finally burst in 1873, which triggered an enormous economic downturn we call a panic in the mid-19th century. This economic, partly it's because of this overinflated bond market, but there's other problems in the American economy. And also railroad played an outside role in the economy of mid to latter 19th century America. Right? Railroads weren't just the rail lines themselves. They supported workers who worked on the rail lines. They supported steel and iron companies who were producing the material for the cars and the rails. They were supporting lumberjacks who had to chop down all those trees to create the ties that run on a rail line. You have to fuel these rail cars and the railroads with coal, so it fuels the coal industry. There's a whole series of things that are tethered to the railroad market. So when the railroad market bursts dramatically and companies go bankrupt and railroads stop running in the same volume that they did before, it has a really outsized effect and the economy tanks. So here in these fine United States, we know who to blame when the economy tanks, whoever's in power. In 1873, with the economic panic of 1873, excuse me, the people in power are the Republican Party. And across the American South, there are white Southern Democrats who have been out of power, who have been agitating and seeking ways to get back into power. Remember, by 1873, the vast majority of those who have been disenfranchised under the Reconstruction Acts of 1867 have now gotten their vote back. So in 1873, this is not a federal election year, but one's coming around the corner in 1874. So how do people make their displeasure known? They vote out the position in power, which is the Republican Party. And so in the 1874 election, we have some dramatic results, most visibly in the House of Representatives, where as a result of the 1874 election, what was a 114-seat Republican majority in the U.S. Congress had turned to a 61 Democratic majority, right? That's a 160 or 75 seat swing. That is a tremendous swing in fortunes. Now, the swing is less dramatic in the Senate because only 1/3 of the senators are up, and also the Senate has historically greater powers, I suppose, of incumbency. Senators, they can lose, certainly has happened, but they don't lose nearly as often as the House of Representatives folks in re-election. So this has dramatically turned the House, which had been a Republican majority, to now it's a Democrat majority, Democrat-led majority. And in the Senate, it's a Republican majority, but it's a much thinner Republican majority. 1874 is not a presidential election year, so the president remains the Republican, Ulysses S. Grant. So you have the Republicans controlling narrowly the Senate, and they're still in the chief executive spot, but now the Democrats have captured the House of Representatives. And many of these Democrats are from the American South, and they are opposed to Reconstruction, as just a large degree are their Northern Democratic cohorts who have been opposed to Republican leadership throughout Reconstruction and have tend to favor the interests of the South because the Democratic Party stretched north and south. So there are dire implications for Reconstruction, and they revolve around two of these key elements. One, Reconstruction is expensive, and it's being funded by the federal government, who has had their money coming into the federal government sharply reduced because of this economic panic. So there's even less money available for Congress to spend on Reconstruction. There's also, as we see, less will amongst Northerners and Westerners to continue to fund Reconstruction, partly because of the stories of corruption, and also partly because of, they're out of work, and so they're not keen on the interest of the freedmen and the Republicans in the South as much as they are about their own interests. But even further, now the House of Representatives is in the hands of Democrats who want to overturn what Reconstruction had been doing and had achieved. Right, so it's going to be very dire for the continuance of Reconstruction. This leads us to the dramatic events of the 1876 election, a very unprecedented election in American history. There had been a similar problem in election in 1800, but this one is very different. And it unfolds in the following fashion. 1876 elections, presidential election year, Ulysses S. Grant has served his 2 terms. And so you have the Republican Party is headed by the candidate Rutherford B. Hayes. Rutherford B. Hayes's claim to fame was that he was from Ohio and not directly implicated in any of the corruption that goes on in state politics in Ohio or federal politics in Congress at that time. It would seem to be a very low bar to get over, but apparently that was sufficient for him to be elevated to be the Republican candidate. He was not a terribly inspiring speaker. He was a Union veteran and had been involved in politics in Ohio, but he didn't generate a massive groundswell of people wanting to support him. In fact, one of his major claims to fame is his magnificent set of whiskers that he has. The opponent in this 1876 election is a man by the name of Samuel Tilden. He's a Democrat, because that's the opposite party, but he is from New York, so he's a Northern Democrat. And so this 1876 election unfolds, and Samuel Tilden wins the popular vote. He wins more votes for his election than Rutherford B. Hayes, but there's a problem, of course, as we know in American politics, that has been repeating in increasing frequency in the last generation, that the person who wins the most votes does not necessarily become president. Most recently, we can ask former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton how that works out. So Tilden wins the popular vote, but as we know, the election is decided by electoral votes. In this particular case, Samuel Tilden is 1 short of the majority needed to win the election. He has 184 electoral votes. You need 1 more, 185, to be president. So how can this be? Was there a third party candidate? No, actually what happened was that in 20 districts, there were 2 set of electoral returns delivered. One set said Tilden had won, which would give him an additional electoral vote, which would make him president. And the other one says Rutherford B. Hayes won, which means that it'd be 1 more to Hayes's count, right? So these disputed electoral returns, you have 2 separate set of returns. What do we do, right? So the United States Constitution, our founding fathers have thought of lots of things, but they didn't consider how do you resolve a conflict when you don't have somebody win a majority of the electoral votes. What if there's a number of disputed electoral votes? In this case, 20. And it's of note where they're from. There's 1 from Oregon. There's 4 districts in Florida. There's 8 districts in Louisiana, and there's 7 districts in South Carolina. As you can see, this is tied largely to the issues of Reconstruction, because 19 of the 20 districts are in Reconstruction governments in the South in which there's a dispute. So there's nothing in the Constitution that says how you resolve this. So the Supreme Court can't say how you resolve this. So what do they come up with? Well, they decide they're going to come up with a special electoral commission that's going to examine these 20 different districts and deal with each one and determine which set of returns are valid. Samuel Tilden needs to win just 1 of these 20 investigations, and he will become president, right? Making a Democrat president of the United States in 1876. Rutherford B. Hayes has to win all 20. He has to run the table on this issue. So the Special Electoral Commission, where does it come from? Well, Congress says, how about this? We'll take 5 from the House, which, as we know, in 1876, the House is a majority a Democratic House. So there's going to be 3 Democrats on the commission and 2 Republicans. And we're going to take 5 from the Senate, right? The Senate, as we know, has a majority Republican constituency. So they get 3 Republicans and 2 Democrats. So now we're at 10, 5 from the House, 5 from the Senate, 3 and 2 from both opposite parties. So you have 5 Democrats and 5 Republicans so far. So they have to come up with a third because you need to have an odd number in order things don't get caught up. So they say, we'll take 5 from the Supreme Court. So they take 2 judges who have been nominated by Democrats, and they take 2 judges who have been nominated by Republicans, and they take 1 Supreme Court justice who is an independent. He is not registered with either party. In effect, this 1 justice is going to be the one to determine, because partisan politics have split this between the 2 groups. Now, this Supreme Court justice had just been elected as a member of the Republican Party as a senator. And so he decided to resign his position as Supreme Court Justice, removing him from this group. So they picked another Supreme Court Justice who was a Republican. They examine all 20 cases. They hear, where the returns come from, and they make a judgment. And shockingly, in a series of 28-7 votes, the Republicans win all 20. Every vote split along partisan lines. 8 Republicans voted for Hayes to win the district, 7 for Tilden, right? Well, so there you go. We've got it. It's all set. So now that Hayes is going to win the election. But this is a special electoral commission that is created by the Congress. So the Senate says, well, they've listened to these things. They've done it soundly. We have to accept that because the Senate is a Republican majority body. But the House says, no, we're not willing to accept these returns. And so the Special Electoral Commission's rulings are blocked by the House. They refuse to accept this report, and so they refuse to allow Rutherford B. Hayes to become president. Now, in this fine nation, people get elected to be president, but they don't become president until they're sworn in. At this time, which will be a point we will return to when we talk about the New Deal with Franklin Delano Roosevelt. But at this time, you are still sworn in March. So the election is in November, and you're sworn in March, first week of March. So the Election Commission forms in January of 1877. They come back with a report, and nobody's accepted it. So we're approaching the end of Ulysses Grant's term, and there's no new president to swear in. What are we going to do? This is quite a conundrum, right? I may have said this before, but if not, I'll say it now. I don't believe in conspiracy theories for a variety of reasons, mostly revolving around the fact that conspiracies rely on this complete mastery of events and predictive capability to know exactly what's going to occur in the future. It has not been my experience that conspiracies work the way things want or people expect them to, right? And so in general, I'm opposed to conspiracy theories. Now I'm going to tell you about a conspiracy theory. It's known as the Bargain of 1877 conspiracy theory. And we don't know for sure because nobody involved in this ever came out and said this was actually what occurred. But we do have some evidence which is very suggestive. So what is this evidence? So we're getting closer to the day of the inaugural, and we have no president to swear in. They're still, stuck between Hayes and Tilden, who's going to get the magic number of these electoral votes. And there was a meeting between Democratic leadership of the House and some representatives of Rutherford B. Hayes. How do we know there's a meeting? They met at a hotel on the 2nd floor, and as they came down the steps, the press who had been camped out in the lobby saw the representatives come down and said, hey, what are you guys talking about? And so they refused to discuss what was being discussed between the House leadership and Hayes's representatives. And then a few days later, they held another vote in the House that because of issues of statesmanship, because for the good of the nation and other high-minded ideas, the House accepted the report from the Special Electoral Commission. This made Rutherford B. Hayes the president. When Hayes was elevated to winning the presidency, he did a few things as well. The first thing he did was that in his inaugural speech, he signaled some concepts that were music to the ears of white Southerners. He said things like local authorities should manage local affairs, not federal authorities. That those who are best in position to rule and run government should be in position of ruling government in the South. So words along the line supporting states' rights and supporting local authority as opposed to federal authority. Reconstruction is the exercise of federal authority. They're forcing Reconstruction on the defeated South. Well, now Rutherford B. Hayes is signaling that local authority should return to the fore on managing affairs in local and state districts. He also, the disputed election didn't just return 2 sets of returns for the presidency. They also elected local and state officials in which there were 2 separate groups voted in, one Republican, one Democratic. So who won these elections? They're in dispute as well. All those local elections were awarded to the Democrats. So in the state of Louisiana, the Democratic Party takes over the state house, right? Other positions across the South and South Carolina, these positions go to the Democrats in these disputed positions. Hayes also ordered that the Union Army, a very small rump set of Union occupation in the South, would no longer involve themselves in local events, right? It signals, and it's pointed to as the end of Reconstruction, but as Guelzo points out, Reconstruction was on its way out anyway. This just sort of sealed the deal, right? So this conclusion of Reconstruction, it leads to what's known as Southern redemption. Redemption is not my term. It's the term historians use, drawn upon how this is described. This redemption means the reinstallation of white Southern Democrats into political power, both at the local and state level. What the white Southern Democrats and the white population of the South said was the South had been redeemed. The corrupt, inept, unjust Republican governments had been booted out, and the proper folks, as they saw it, are now reinstalled into power. And what they were interested in doing was undoing the Reconstruction, what Reconstruction had been able to achieve in the American South. So it's an effort to reverse Reconstruction. That's what redemption means in this context. And so what is the method of undoing Reconstruction? Well, it relies upon some way the application of violence. So stripping away the legal and political rights that the freedmen population had in the South comes through the application of violence, in many cases extra legal violence by Klan or local terrorists, white supremacists, right? It also creates, there's a concerted effort to create a much more ennobling vision, which we will hear more about, known as the lost cause, which seeks to redefine what the Civil War is about, from slavery to some other thing, an assertion of states' rights. So it's an effort to propagandize what the war was what it was about at its root, right? Redemption also means the beginning stages installation of something known as Jim Crow, which is the apparatus of local and state laws stripping away the legal protections of the freedmen population. And it's validated most infamously in a Supreme Court case, Plessy versus Ferguson, which we will hear more about in the future. So Jim Crow is part of this redemption effort. And so Guelzo says, what kind of lessons can we take from the events of Reconstruction? Well, as Sherman pointed out, we cannot change these people's minds. What was needed was a lot more time. Time that, in retrospect was needed, but the nation in that post-war period was unlikely to be able or willing to give. So more time was needed because the disenfranchisement, the installation, the protection of the freedmen populations, the protection given to political power to parties who were not white Southern Democrats. It needed more time to be installed, and it didn't get it. So many of the things that Reconstruction failed to achieve, or the things that they did achieve, such as political power, which were undone by Jim Crow, would have to be taken up again under civil rights, right? So civil rights is seen as a second Reconstruction because it's really trying to achieve what Reconstruction failed to achieve in this post-war period. And he ends with a rather somber assessment of these things, a point that in our current time frame rings even more closer to the heart than when Guelzo wrote this book a few years ago. So Guelzo ends with the following quote and commentary from Susie King Taylor, a slave-born teacher and military nurse. And she says, "Was the war in vain? Has it brought freedom in the full sense of the word, or has it not made our condition more hopeless?" A century and a half later, her question still echoes horribly, and in today's world, echoes louder yet. Okay, that's it for Guelzo's book. If you pay attention to the questions that are posted, take a run at them, and then we will soon have the test. So review this material and make sure you post any questions you may have. See you in the next series. We'll be talking about things revolving around the Progressive Era.